Well, today we are delighted to have Seth Blaylock with us. This is a real treat because this is another kind of international perspective that we're going to have, and so that I hope that's helpful as we kind of try to present as broad kind of perspective of different career paths that are available to you. So Seth comes to us from the U.S. Department of State. He is a BYU alumni, and so hopefully he can give you a sense of how he got from where you are to where he is today, and how you might be able to do that as well. So as with our previous speakers, he'll talk for a while, and then please have some questions, and we'll have a good discussion afterwards. So please welcome Seth Blaylock.
Thank you, Professor Barber. Once again, happy to be here. I intend to share about how I did get to where I am today. Hopefully it's instructive about the State Department and careers and what it's actually like to be a Foreign Service officer. Before I get there, though, I will share a resume tip. Resumes, very important, and mostly just to not screw things up. So the resumes I really remember are the bad ones. So once in my job, I was hiring another, a diplomat for my office, and one of the applicants had put at the bottom of their thing, the kind of other interest or whatever, had put under a bullet point, the youngest Foreign Service officer in my entering class. And I cannot think of why this person needed to brag about that. And also, it might indicate to me that you are immature. First of all, that if you are the youngest, and that you also decided to put it on there. So anyway, I'll start there. So I am a Foreign Service officer at the U.S. Department of State, and I have a clicker. Okay, so background on Seth. I am from Orem, Utah. I grew up in Orem, and then I moved across town to Orem, and then I graduated and went to BYU. Here at BYU, I was a political science and print journalism double majored. I will say the focus, although I was very interested in the political science aspect, my focus was more like the journalism aspect, and I worked at the newspaper, the Daily Universe. I had tons of fun. I thought about being a journalist. This is I graduated in 2001, but I decided that maybe I wanted to go to grad school and do something and work for the government. Now, unlike Professor Barber here, I did not care enough for obscure surveys to do a PhD, so I decided to go to law school. I went to law school never really intending to be a lawyer, and I really loved law school. I went to NYU and kind of focused on international stuff. I really liked the studies there, the research, the kind of things that we got into, but I'm very happy I'm not a lawyer. But once you get to law school, they make you think you want to be a lawyer, and everybody's competing for these law jobs, including me, and you start to think to yourself, oh, maybe I'll work for a corporate law job for a couple of years, make some money, and then go to the government. That didn't work out, and I ended up joining the FBI. So at the end of my law school career, I applied for this Presidential Management Fellowship program. This is definitely something to keep an eye out for everybody. If you haven't heard about it, it is an opportunity for people coming out of grad school, whether it's PhD, law school, or a master's, to basically fast track into government service. And getting in is kind of similar to getting into the Foreign Service. You have to apply, write essays and stuff, and then there's an oral exam. And then once you make it into the fellowship, they invite you to DC and you can go to this big job fair. And I ended up working at the FBI doing counterterrorism analysis, which I really liked. I was there for 4 years, focusing on Southeast Asia, counterterrorism, and stuff like that. So I will say I never had a gun. I was just a computer guy basically doing strategic analysis about Jamaat Islamiyah and stuff like that. But pretty soon I realized that I wanted to be more internationally focused. At the FBI, we kind of focus on the homeland. So I applied for the Foreign Service. I took the test. I think I didn't make it the first time. So the next year I took the test again and I got in. But by the time, the whole listing and clearances and stuff come through, it was another year. So I was at the FBI for 4 years before I joined the Foreign Service. Okay, so very quickly, I think you guys know what the State Department is, so I'll go through this really quick. But keep in mind, these are kind of the main things that we focus on, right? We're supporting American citizens, and I will say I put that first because first and foremost, that's what the State Department does. When you think about my job day to day is kind of more about things like trade negotiations and programs to fight terrorism and stuff like that. But really, when it comes down to it, the most important thing is the safety of American citizens. I worked for a time in the State Department Operations Center, which is kind of our emergency 24-hour watching the world thing. And a lot of what we do there is, again, helping people, but also helping the Secretary of State connect to world leaders. We take notes, and that's all very interesting. But all bets were off if there was a plane crash or an earthquake or a war. In those cases, we drop everything and we take care of Americans. That's what we do. So you can read the rest of it yourself. But I also would like to emphasize that we are the face of America overseas. So that's important too. When we're recruiting, we're hoping people that come in, they have good language skills and they can write and do a good job, but also you're there to represent the United States, right? So we want good behavior. We want people who can show a good face of the United States and all facets of the United States. Nothing to me was more fascinating than see Malaysians react when our ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, was Korean American who had a Korean dialect, who had a Korean accent. It was just kind of a real cognitive dissonance moment for them, but kind of wonderful. So a little bit about me. I joined the State Department, and they sent me to the Philippines, where I was a consular officer. And after 2 years, I went to Belgium. They taught me French to go work at our mission to the European Union. And then after that, I went to Washington, D.C. and worked at our operations center. After a year of doing that, I went to Malaysia, where I worked on domestic politics and human rights. And then I went to Pakistan for a year without my family, what we call an unaccompanied tour. So my family stayed in Malaysia, where they were kind of comfortable and going to school. And I was in Pakistan helping fight terrorism. After that, I went back to DC and worked as the North Korea unit chief during the time of Singapore Agreement and the Hanoi Summit. After that, I went back to the Philippines, where I was the Rule of Law and Counterterrorism unit chief, where I had a $40 million grant bucket to help the Filipinos fight terrorism, also working on human rights issues. After I left there, I came back here, and right this year I'm living in Utah and working for a DC job remotely, where I am training our diplomats around the world on how to respond to crisis. So like I said, we care about Americans. We care especially about the people that we send overseas, military, U.S. diplomats like me. So in the case of a flood or civil unrest somewhere, how do we protect the embassy, our people, and Americans, right? So I think I just included a couple pictures here. That's me and my family in Paris. One of the best things about Brussels is you can get on a train and 75 minutes later you're in Paris. Not too long after, that's us in the Philippines. We lived right next to the Petronas Towers. And this is during my North Korea stint. After the Hanoi summit, I flew with my boss to Beijing to brief the Chinese about the summit, and then we flew to Moscow to brief the Russians about the summit, and then we flew to Brussels to brief NATO and the EU, and then we flew home. So that was my first time going all the way around the world. I'm going to share a little bit about what it means to be a diplomat. So, yes, exciting travel opportunities. It sounds impressive sometimes to say I'm a diplomat if people actually know what you do. I'm convinced my mom doesn't really quite understand what I do. It has good benefits. Like I mentioned, I have a family. Where we go, they help, they house us. They put my kids in a nice school. They make sure that we're safe and taken care of. And it's just like any other government job. I don't get paid $1 million, but I do fine, and I get good leave, and I have a pretty good work-life balance, I think. But most of the time, even though there's these exciting aspects, it's just a job. And a lot of my day is emailing people, trying to figure out who to CC on an email, doing paperwork, so that's all there. But it's just punctuated by exciting things. I'll also be clear too, it's not always easy. I was just chatting with a friend of mine who was in Kyiv very recently and had to evacuate with him and his family. And he went to Kyiv thinking, oh, this is going to be a great European tour. We can kind of relax. I'll look over economic issues. And now his family's back here safe and sound. He's working on a task force day and night, so you just never know what is going to happen. And definitely COVID hit a lot of us very hard. It's, with the world kind of shutting down, it meant a lot more isolation. It was a lot more difficult to do our job, and hopefully that's starting to change. But at the same time, I think what I really like about my job and the whole kind of reason that I got into this is because I wanted to do good, right? I'm under no illusions that I'm by myself saving the world or everything I do is extremely important, but there are good opportunities to do that. I have been given responsibility and I can use that for good. So the hope is that you use your power for good, you don't abuse it. So a couple of highlights I wanted to show you. Human rights, right? So I've been able to work on human rights a lot of my career in the Philippines, Malaysia, even at our mission to the EU. I've done cool things like observing elections in the Philippines, going out in the sticks and seeing how they actually do things and reporting it back to see if it's on the level or not. I've monitored protests that are, the government's cracking down in Malaysia. I've attended many a trial, trumped up political trial for opponents of the government in Malaysia and also the Philippines. Excuse me. And I've been able to do a lot of work helping administer grants and aids to groups and people who are doing good. One highlight here, this is Nisha Ayub and John Kerry, if you don't know what John Kerry looks like. This is kind of a highlight for me because in Malaysia, working on human rights, Malaysia is a Muslim country, majority Muslim. And if you look into it, it's a very strange system that they have that's kind of apartheid a little bit for the majority Muslims, right? At the same time, though, the Muslims are very controlled. So the Muslims in the country have to follow Sharia law, right? And although there's generally freedom of religion, you cannot proselytize to Muslims. Muslims can't change their religion. Nisha is a Malay, so defined as Muslim, and Indian person. She was put in jail for wearing women's clothing a couple of years ago. And they sent her to a men's prison where she was abused by the guards and the inmates for several months. When she got out of there, she wasn't broken. She actually decided to do something about it. So she has heroically started any number of projects. She has like a drop-in center for homeless transgender people in central Kuala Lumpur. She has, a program where she tries to teach people and corporations, what it means, gender, what are the issues, and this is a very touchy subject in Malaysia. I had the privilege of nominating Nisha for the International Woman of Courage Award. This was the first transgender International Woman of Courage that we had in the State Department. And the big deal about this, other than that handshake with John Kerry, is this has given Nisha a platform, right? You send these people to the United States to get the award. Then they go for several weeks around the US and make connections with other NGOs, lawyers, people of interest. And it has allowed her to go back to Malaysia and kind of expand her platform. And so hopefully other people like her won't get abused in prison again. I've worked a lot on counterterrorism as well. There's the fundamental difference between what I did at the FBI and what I do at the State Department is I'm actually on the ground. That's not to mean I'm fighting terrorists, but I get to go out into the field. This is a picture from the Philippines, recent, where the United States has donated millions of dollars worth of equipment. This is you can see, it's a variety of stuff, including flak jackets for people trying to defuse bombs and stuff like that. It was a privilege to work in the Philippines, to actually be that person helping, right? Because I saw and I analyzed the terrorism issue in the Philippines for a long time. Here I was on the ground helping out. And what we do is kind of holistic, which is what I like about it. We're not just arming the police. We're also spending all this money training police to respect human rights and prosecutors to actually understand evidence, or financial transactions, stuff like that. And we also have a lot of programming that goes to the drivers of terrorism in that area, which is, at root economic. And this also pertains to human rights as well. One of my big jobs in the Philippines this last time was as the Leahy Rights Coordinator, so Leahy Vetting Coordinator. We have a law in the U.S. that says we can't give money to police or militaries around the world if they have a history of gross violations of human rights. If you're not familiar with the Philippines at the moment, their president is pretty hardcore on the war on drugs, and in so many words, told his police that if they see a drug dealer, they can just shoot him, right? They're just shortcutting justice, right? So a lot of people get killed, some by police, some by people, vigilantes, stuff like that. And so we are actually very limited in the things that we can do with police. But because they depend and want our aid and help, I have seen how the way that we administer aid has changed the behavior of certain police groups, and that's to the good. So I also worked on the North Korea desk as the North Korea unit chief. Don't be too impressed by that title, but I was basically leading the team at the State Department who's supporting the special representative for North Korea and also the secretary in the nuclear negotiations. This is a picture of the Hanoi summit that didn't go as well as anybody would like, but that was an interesting experience working on North Korea as well, right? We're very focused on trying to denuclearize North Korea, and that has not changed. We're kind of waiting on the North Koreans to actually do something, and we can talk about that at length if we want, but this is part and parcel of trying to keep America and the world safe, right? We don't want a nuclear North Korea. At the same time, I was privileged to work on humanitarian aid in North Korea. So we spend a lot of time in my office helping prepare for the negotiations, at the same time working with our allies and partners around the world to ensure that sanctions against North Korea are still in effect and they're not getting around them. They're very good at getting around them. But also we try to provide support to the North Korean people where we can. Right? So if you didn't know, one of the groups that is working in North Korea is the LDS Charities. This was news to me until I met somebody who worked for the LDS Charities. We have a charity program that's been going on there for a long time, which is cattle breeding, which would help provide more protein for the people of North Korea. That's interesting, and we do what we can to support those programs. I will say, though, as a caveat, whenever I talk about North Korea, is to tell people don't go to North Korea. One of my jobs on the North Korea desk was to approve people going to North Korea. So under U.S. law, if you want to go to North Korea, you have to apply for a passport, special passport, and then I am one of the people that gets to decide whether we want you to or not based on the U.S. national interest. It kind of comes down to transnational humanitarian aid, journalism, or whatever's in our national interest. But there are plenty of people who are like, I love the world and I love people, and I've been taking pictures and putting them on my Instagram, and I feel like if I go to North Korea, it will increase understanding. And I would tell them no, partly because there's a history in North Korea of using foreigners, U.S. citizens, as hostages in negotiations. And we don't have an embassy there, so I want you to be protected, so please don't go to North Korea. And also, if you do go to North Korea, you're basically putting money in the pockets of the regime. So anyway. Okay, so I just have a few slides really quick that's kind of more on the career side, right? So I work in the Foreign Service. That includes generalist, which I am, specialist, which is kind of, I work on many different tracks. I can work in economic or consular or political issues. The specialists are generally just specialize in human resources or computer issues, finance, those kinds of things. And I guess we have limited non-career appointments, but that's if you basically work as a Foreign Service officer, but it's limited in time. There's also the Civil Service. So in the State Department, we have Foreign Service, which goes out most of the time. Civil Service, which is mostly based in D.C. or other places in the United States. They do all kinds of stuff. And a lot of the Civil Service does the same job as I do. When I was in DC working in North Korea, half my office was Foreign Service, half of my office was Civil Service. The Civil Service, the benefits there is you kind of get to build a expertise, whereas I flit from place to place and subject to subject, which is its own reward, I think. Some people would rather say, I'm focusing on China and this is what I want to do, or I'm focusing on Ukraine or missile negotiations, that's what I want to do. So there's a variety of things, and you can see up here all the different ways that you can join the Department of State. This audience, I'm sure you're pretty aware of these programs. I will say that if you do have an opportunity to do an internship, especially at an embassy overseas, go for it. I never did, but I see when we have interns coming in, we love them, and they're really good. And you're usually working in the summer, which means that people like me are back in Utah having a good time with our families, and you get to actually take over and do some pretty substantive stuff. Okay, so you can look at all that stuff if you want to know more. I just want to end before going to questions to talk about how, going back to doing good, right? That's the whole point, is we're trying to serve our country. And in that way, we believe that our country and the principles upon which we are founded are good and good for everybody. And it's been a real privilege to work on those things, even though most of the time maybe I'm just writing emails. There are those points where I feel like I can help make a difference in Americans' life, people around the world. And I think that goes toward people that I work with, right? I try to help mentor the people that I work with and that work for me. And right now I'm out, training our embassies on how to deal with a crisis. So hopefully that comes in handy when there is a crisis. I'm happy to talk about those things that maybe aren't the most fun about the State Department that could be difficult, right? Sometimes having a family and traveling around can be difficult. There are always issues with spouses and jobs and those kinds of things. We also have more and more things that seem to be affecting us, right? What I alluded to COVID earlier, how that's making things more difficult. We can also talk about the anomalous health incidents that you've seen in Cuba and China and other places that are a little bit worrying to me. And then also you just see that in some ways the world's becoming more dangerous for the kind of stuff that we do as the authoritarian regimes kind of start to really clamp down on everything from speech to allowing NGOs to operate. But I firmly believe that if we do this work and we look outward and look for ways to help, we can help understand each other and build toward a better world, more peaceful world. And I think that's something the church also teaches us. So with that, I will stop and answer any questions you guys might have.
The microphone is up there, as we've done in the past.
Okay, so you mentioned that had you been in a different track, or sorry, civil service has a lot more stability, a lot more progression, right? Which track are you in? You
So
said
I'm in the Foreign Service.
Yeah, but there's like the 5 cones.
Oh,
rather.
I'm a politically coned officer.
Oh, okay, so does that have more diversity in like nation to nation? Whereas maybe if you're like in the financial or if you're in the management cone, that has more stability. What are those dynamics? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Okay. So good question. So I will like I was telling Professor Barber earlier, this is a career where you're trying to like balance everything. They want you to be everything at once, right? If you're a political officer, they want you to have great experience as a political officer and maybe specialize in a region. But at the same time, they want you to have experience in other regions and experience working outside your cone, right? So you try to balance that. As a political officer, you can kind of work any of the cones, you can work anywhere. And often, I wouldn't say that that's dependent on the cone you are. Like in many ways, if you're a consular officer or a management officer, management officers, you're just focused on the management of the embassy. And those kinds of principles, they transfer anywhere around the world. So they're not really dependent on having expertise in a region, maybe like mine does. So you might be more flexible, but really it doesn't matter. And as a political officer, I can work as a management officer. I can work as a public affairs officer. It just depends on the day and whether I get the job.
I just had a quick question about family life, actually.
Sure.
So you have those wonderful pictures of your wife and your kids. Well, one, has your wife ever had to work to support your family once you enter the Foreign Service? And then two, what are the options if she does want to work?
Okay, good question. I will say that if we start with the question, like, does a spouse need to work? Answer is no, but it just depends on what you want to do, right? I feel like I will tell you this, to live in Washington, D.C., and have a family, it's extremely expensive. And every time we go back to DC, we feel it. It's much more lucrative to be overseas because when I'm overseas, I'm assigned housing and I don't have to pay for my housing. So that in and of itself is a huge boon. For people that have 2-income households, it's often a burden to leave DC. So if you have a spouse and their career, let's say they're a lawyer and their career is based in DC. If you move to China, they can't really easily be a lawyer in China. So then you're like trying to figure out what will they do? Will they work? Will they not work? Right? So there's the financial issue, but then there's also just the, I'll say, ambition issue. Foreign Service officers are pretty ambitious. I feel like I'm medium ambitious, and they tend to be married to people that are also, intellectually curious and ambitious, and they are hard-charging people, right? So, and I will say it's a mix. There are people who are both Foreign Service officers, and we call those tandem couples. And that's difficult because you have a hard time lining up jobs in the same place. You have people whose spouse work and then they just try to figure out, go to a place where the spouse can get a job. It's dependent. So my wife, I'm extremely lucky. She is a instructional designer. So she creates online training for a job. And she was doing that when we were in DC, and then I joined the Foreign Service. And even before that, we had our first baby, and her company was like, oh, do you want to work from home? So she was like, sure, I'll do that. So she's worked over the years part-time to full-time. And then when we went back to DC this last time in 2017, she got a job working full-time at the State Department Foreign Service Institute. So we kind of work together now. It's odd. But they've allowed her to keep working remotely, and it's a very fulfilling job. There's also many jobs available at the embassies when you go overseas. I will be frank that those aren't the most interesting or the greatest or the best paying, right? So if they have like a captive population there and many people who need jobs, they say like, oh, we have a job, maybe it's a office manager type role or somebody to investigate security incidents or something like that. Those jobs tend to pay $30,000 to $40,000 a year, which is a lot lower than you would get otherwise. Then there are people who decide not to work or do something else, volunteer. It's a variety. But I will say that whether you're a tandem or your wife works or your wife doesn't work, all of these moves and decisions on where your family is going to be, we're all making those decisions, right? And where I go definitely impacts, right? So when I was in the Philippines this last time, my wife was working, but she had to work DC hours, so she had to work all night. Not ideal. Now we're going to Belgium, and she'll be able to work afternoons, right? So that's much better. So whatever your family needs are, I think you just need to put those first and try to figure out what is the best for your family. So when I'm trying to get a job in a certain place, I'm going back to Belgium this summer. We're at the age my kids are teenagers, so we're thinking a lot about schools. So we're trying to get to where we think the school is good for them and will be a good job for me and will work for my wife and that will have good internet and croissants or whatever, right? So I will say it's always a negotiation. And over the years, the State Department has tried to do better about taking care of families instead of just assuming that my wife and my children are just chained to me and following me wherever they want to go, wherever I want to go. It's a lot more complicated and complex than that. Okay. Yeah.
So this is just a little bit off topic, but not really. So were you at all like involved in the situation with Otto Warmbier or whoever that was with North Korea, and how was that situation handled, like in your view, with the State Department and all that?
So I'll plead that I'm not an expert in that, also because it's a sensitive subject, but I joined the North Korea desk shortly after Otto Warmbier came home. But I will say that was an extremely important case. My boss at the time, he was the person who went over, it's just like, it's a huge deal, and it was a huge tragedy. And so part and parcel of the reason why we tell people not to go to North Korea, And I've met the Warmbiers because they are very active in fighting against North Korea, and they're very interested in what we were doing, right? But I don't know how much more I can say about it that will be helpful to you. But basically, don't go to North Korea. Don't go to a place that uses human beings as hostages.
Hi. So feel free to simply brush by or disregard this question if you feel that you don't want to answer it too sensitive or regardless. But you mentioned the Havana syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've read some articles claiming that it's completely benign and like not caused by nefarious forces. Others claim that it's a targeted campaign. Some claim it's some mix of the two. I was just wondering what's the truth there?
A good question, and I don't know.
Okay.
But I will echo the words of our, I get reports on it from the Secretary of State with everybody else. And I see the reports that come out. So I think very recently there was a report that came out that said, well, we're leaning towards it is like kind of more of an imagined thing. But I will say that the president and the Secretary of State and others are taking it very seriously, because whatever is happening, there are people suffering. And for somebody like me, you think, oh, I'm going to bid on, our embassy in Cuba, which I think was just announced that we might be, I think I saw a headline today that we're going to reopen the embassy in Cuba. But you have to stop and think to yourself, is that going to endanger me, right? So whatever the cause, there's definitely effects of people, my colleagues, right? And I think it's been shown that some people have been injured in some way. So the question is, what are we doing about it? And it's kind of one of those unknowns, but it's the same kind of unknown where I don't know if I get assigned to Ukraine, is war going to break out all of a sudden? Like we're to the point now where my daughter's asking me, is this war in Ukraine going to mess up our assignment to Belgium? And my answer is no, but who knows what might happen. So I'm grateful that the U.S. government and the Secretary of State is taking it very seriously, and they're trying to track it down. But it's scary. Just the idea of it's scary, and maybe that's the intended effect. I don't know. I mean, this is really just me pontificating in things that I don't know about, but it's a reality. That's something you have to worry about.
So you mentioned a little bit about your education and the positions you had leading up to the Foreign Service. I was wondering what I guess kind of the path you would recommend to entering the Foreign Service, because you went to law school and then the FBI, and do you think experience like that is necessary, or any advice you could give about leading into the Foreign Service?
Sure, good question. I will say that there's no one set path for sure. And that's one of the wonderful things about it, right? It's kind of tries to be a meritocracy, right? Where anybody can take the test. I don't think you even need a college degree to take the test, right? You do need some kind of commensurate experience. And when I entered in 2008, there was 60 of us in the entering class. It ranged from 24 was the youngest person to 50 something was the oldest person. So some people are in their second, third career. Some people were, some people were lawyers for 5 years and then decided to join. Some people were working in international relations already. Some people, one or two, were just out of college and grad school. So there's no set thing, but you can look it up. There's definitely kind of things that they look for in the test. So, passing the test is one of them. And then there's an essay portion, and then there's an oral exam. They're looking for these 13 dimensions, right? Written communication, important, adaptability, if they think you can actually adapt. So if you have some experience being in different places, that helps, but it's not controlling factor, but it helps show that you have that experience. One of the things they're really looking for is judgment, right? So that can they trust you with responsibility, basically. So it ranges. I was telling the professor, I work with somebody who got their master's in modern dance. I joined when I was 30. That seems to be about the median age, but it's younger or older. It just totally depends. So they take all kinds, and they take people from all over the place. Definitely, it doesn't hurt to have some international experience, because you can have that behind you. I feel like my entering class, 2/3 of them were former Peace Corps volunteers, and then 5 were returned Mormon missionaries, right? So that gives you an idea of the population that is probably self-selecting, right, in deciding that they want to do this. We all have some kind of international experience. We're trying to replicate it. We had a positive experience. but it definitely doesn't hurt in getting in. So I will say, if you're interested, take the test. You may not get in right away. And you also, it may take a while, so you just make other plans. And then if your number comes up, great. Or you want to work a few years and then try it, that's fine too.
Kind of as a follow-up to that question, in what ways do the world of law and the Foreign Service overlap, and how did law school prepare you for your current career path?
Okay. Again, I feel like there's no one thing necessary. I do feel like law school helped prepare me for what we do. Because as a political officer, a lot of what I do is writing. I kind of sometimes describe myself as a journalist with a top secret clearance, right? At the same time, you're a government person with responsibility, so you are basically following, interpreting law all the time. I will say the place where my law degree helped the most was my first tour as a consular officer. I was the person standing at the window in the Philippines interviewing 120 people a day who wanted to come visit the United States. And in that situation, you're basically a judge with no review. Like, you are the last spot. Like, if I refuse you a visa, you can't do anything about it other than apply again. So it's a huge responsibility. And I found it was actually I found my law brain working a lot as I was looking at the consular law, the visa code, and trying to interpret it in the best way I could, right? The same way when we work on immigration law, like, have these people met the standard? What do they need to do? All that kind of thing. And then, so there's that, but just the way that law school teaches you how to think, question, I think that's very important too. A lot of what we do as diplomats is talk to the other side and try to understand. So a lot of it, you're trying to think about how they're thinking. You're trying to think, because I know how I think and how I would do something, but can I imagine what the Russians, what does Putin want? But at the same time, you're also trying to think of how Putin thinks about you, right? This was extremely difficult with the North Koreans, let me tell you. But just using that kind of law school inquiry about not just what you believe, but like, well, what could it be? Kind of opens you up to the possibilities, and I think keeps you open and helps that kind of diplomatic communication. But again, you don't have to go to law school. And I would tell people, don't go to law school unless you want to be a lawyer. I'm kind of the exception, but it was a lot and pretty expensive. So unless you're really clear that you want to be a lawyer, or you're clear about how you're going to pay for it, then maybe don't go to law school. A lot of my lawyer friends hate their jobs.
Yeah, so I'm an accounting major, and actually really interested in the FBI also. That was great to hear about. So maybe just any advice you have for, like, coming from a business background, how to go into public service.
I would say however you want. Like, business perspective, I think, is very valuable in government service, whether it's the Foreign Service. I know a lot of accounting majors end up being FBI agents, right? They love that kind of background because there's a lot of financial crimes going on. So I think, like I said, we value a variety of experiences. So the only thing you really need to get into public service is a way in. So taking the Foreign Service test or taking the FBI test is a way in, or just looking for those opportunities. But there's a lot of things that you can do, whether you want to be, somebody working in accounting and finance in the government or do something else. I feel like what you major in college doesn't ultimately matter. Maybe if you're an electrical engineer, it does, but otherwise, my wife, she majored in film and history, and now she works as an instructional designer because she worked at BYU for the Center for Instructional Design, and that kind of put her on the path. I majored in journalism, but I got more out of working at the newspaper than I did in my classes. Not that the classes weren't valuable and I learned a lot, but just because you majored in political science or accounting doesn't mean you can't do any number of things. Having a college degree is kind of like, I am able to learn things and get through a thing. So that's like the ultimate resume builder. Sorry if I don't have any specific advice about that.
That was great.
So you kind of already answered this question talking about like how it's really important to be empathetic and to have good judgment. But I guess if you had to pick like a couple of qualities or traits that you feel like are the most important traits that a diplomat could have, what would you think that, I guess, what are those traits, I should say?
Okay, good question. I will say, kind of openness to different ideas, right? Because whether you ultimately believe them or not, you need to understand how people think, why things the way they are, right? You need to be open to that. I think being a team player is hugely important, not just in my organization, but every organization. Like I go from place to place, and although, you kind of think the meaty work of a diplomat is kind of what I did in Malaysia, where I was like on the streets, like covering the protests and writing reports and stuff like that. Now I'm to the point where I'm kind of more in a management. So ultimately, we all are doing leadership and management. So learning how to work with people is hugely important, right? That goes to even if you're not supervising, managing up, whether you're working with your foreign country contacts or your bosses, that's important. And then my ultimate advice in success in the world is to not be annoying, right? You may have heard a little bit about how we get our jobs in the Foreign Service. So very recently I bid and I got a job, this job that I'm going to in Belgium that I'm very excited about. Getting the job, once you're in the Foreign Service, they're not going to kick you out, but every couple years we have to apply for a job. That includes sending your resume, that includes interviews, but when it comes down to it, a lot of it is what we call corridor reputation, which is a very State Department thing, right? So yes, he looks good on paper or he writes good cables, but, is he annoying? Do people want to work with him? Basically. So once I'd done 3 or 4 tours, I now feel like anytime I meet somebody and say and they're like, oh yeah, I just came back from Ashgabat, I can say like, oh, do you know such and such? He was in Ashgabat. It's a small enough world that you know people wherever you go. So if you are the kind of person that has a bad reputation, you can't work with people or you have issues, that will follow you. You may continue to get promoted, but you'll have difficulty getting the jobs that you want because people won't want to work with you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Insofar as you're able to answer, can you talk generally about what it's like to work in the State Department as the administration changes? And then specifically, what was it like to work for the previous administration where foreign policy seemed to sometimes arise out of kind of odd statements made on Twitter?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my pat answer to that is it usually doesn't matter, right? Okay. So I came at the FBI, and then when I joined the State Department, it was still George W. Bush, and then very quickly became the Obama administration. And I've worked for several different secretaries of state, and usually the wonderful thing about the State Department is foreign policy is kind of U.S. interests is kind of an agreed upon set of issues, right? We all agree that free trade is great and we like human rights and who our allies are, who they aren't, and even if things kind of change in the margins a little bit, it usually doesn't end up mattering that much. Definitely, frankly, working during the last administration was strange because things were happening in a kind of reverse way, right? Like you said, things seemed to arise and we were reacting to it. But, you know, at least on all the issues that I worked on, for example, North Korea, right? High profile, very important issue to the president. And you could disagree with the way he was going, you know, trying to denuclearize North Korea or the manner in which things were going. But I think we still agreed that it's a good idea not to have like nuclear weapons in North Korea. So I've never had an issue. There were times where my colleagues felt like they needed to stand up and say, I don't agree with this particular policy. And I think that's great. I feel like most of the time my job is to make policy recommendations. So based on this is what we think that the policy should be. And if my Secretary of State disagrees and wants to do something else, then you do it. But you have done your job. Of course, there could come a time where you feel like you can't, in good conscience, you know, do a certain thing or support a particular policy, and in that case, you need to leave the office or resign. And I've had friends that have done that. But I will say that working as a bureaucrat, most of the time you're working for the administration, right? And that's what we do. And I feel free to speak my mind within that system. And if I disagree with something, I'll try to change it. That's anything from non-controversial to controversial. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
You mentioned you were in the Philippines, and you brought up the president of the Philippines making a statement about shooting drug dealers, and I think our president endorsed that policy. Were you in the Philippines when that?
That must have been before I got there, yeah. But again, and that was a very weird time because there definitely was like what the president was saying could be very changeable, but we have our core policy. So just because a tweet went out didn't mean necessarily that we flipped everything around. We would try to get clarification and, you know, because those definitely things could change overnight for sure. Yeah.
We'll give you our final question.
Awesome. Hey, so you mentioned the civil service and like working in country, but with like foreign service stuff. So I assume like consulates, embassies. How does one go about doing that? Because you mentioned the FSOT, the foreign service test, and the FBI test. Is there a test that someone takes to work in country for foreign service departments?
Okay, so are you asking about the civil service?
Yeah. So like working civil service, like if you were to work stateside,
Okay.
because you mentioned how like half of the people that you worked with.
But see, this was stateside. But I will say this: like civil service, most of the time they will be like almost always they will be working in D.C. Right? We have a huge amount of people, but there are opportunities. A lot of civil service people, let's say you work on a particular country, you work on Burma, and you develop an expertise in that. You're the Burma office deputy director. You may not serve full time in the embassy in Rangoon, but you will travel out there, supporting high level trips or going on your own. Also, there are some opportunities for civil service to kind of what they call excursion tours to get experience outside in an embassy. So those opportunities exist. I have friends who are foreign service officers, but mostly prefer to be in DC when they can, and they like living in DC and then doing travel. I prefer going to a place and staying there. I think traveling for businesses is overrated. Like, it's much more fun to point out the Kremlin afterwards than to be on that Aeroflot flight for 8 hours from Beijing, So, but yeah, there's a variety of different opportunities. But if you want to serve overseas, a lot of the time, foreign service is where you want to be.
Okay, thank you so much.